Hello and good evening, good morning. Welcome to PSSL Week 7 on this Valentine's Day. So I just want to wish you and your significant others, if you have one, a happy Valentine's Day as well. So week 7 YouTube, just starting off with announcements. Adobe Connect session this Thursday, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll go back to the original one just to make sure everyone's a little bit more accommodated. I know people on the East Coast had trouble, particularly if you had work next night at 10 o'clock. So we'll shift back to 9 o'clock, and hopefully that's a little bit more accommodating to everyone. What we'll do is about a 20-minute brief. Whoever's doing Group 3, who's doing the Boston Marathon attack, they'll do a 25-minute brief. We'll have about a 20 to 30-minute jobs talk, working in the federal careers or working in the federal government, working at DHS, DOD. And then I'll leave it up for some questions on the final. So that should cover the full hour. Please, if you're not going to be able to make it, let me know, and I could try and make alternative arrangements. But that's what we're looking at for the Adobe Connect session. Paper 2 is pretty good, much better than Paper 1. I think this was a little bit more of a concrete topic, so there's a little bit less esoteric, and that's maybe why the quality of writing was a little bit better. Just a couple of things. You need to mention the science of WMD. If you're going to talk about ricin or sarin being a threat to the homeland or not being a threat to the homeland, you have to talk about the shelf life of sarin, the breakup of sarin, the difficulties in handling sarin, binary versus unitary. You need to get to those technical details that are very important. So I said it was better, more clear. Again, discuss the science. Provide counterpoints. Again, someone's going to come up, particularly if you're talking about WMD, and say, "Hey, we need to worry about this threat. This is a pretty big deal." You need to provide a counter argument for that person that's going to bring that up. And then the final point I'll just bring up is think of Ebola. And I know this happened before the course started, but whether you're the governor of Texas, the mayor of New York, you have to speak on Ebola, even though you are not an expert on the epidemiology of Ebola. So think of what words he needs to use, what diction, what language he needs to use to calm fears if there's an Ebola crisis. So the governor's not a national security expert, he's not an epidemiologist. He's going to go to someone like you and say, is there a problem with Ebola? And if there isn't, give me language I can get up in front of the people so I can tell them that it's not a threat. So think about that. I know most people said these issues, ricin and chemical weapons in Syria, weren't a threat. But think about how it responds to the real world, whether you're the governor or you're mayor or you're advising the mayor, and how they kind of calm nerves and what language they use to do that. So make sure you that's part of your analysis when you're doing this paper, and it's also part of for the last paper as well. Just think through, someone's going to have to, whether you're doing counterterrorism strategy, intelligence, and counterterrorism, someone's going to have to get in front of the media or get in front of a public audience and defend what you've written. So one, make sure it's right, because if it's wrong and someone says something that's wrong because you've written in a paper, you're going to be out of a job. And two, make sure that the argument flows well enough so that a public audience is well schooled or well aware of what you're trying to say. So that's all I'll kind of say about paper 2. Again, much better job this quarter than last. So week 6 review, good discussion we've had this past week. Just one thing I didn't say in the lecture, and I don't think the National Geographic movie talked about in detail. So that did talk about, what do you do if you get the Bin Laden determined to attack in the U.S. That was briefed to the president about a month before 9/11. And let's just say the president gets that briefing and you're his intel analyst, and he turns back to you and says, what do you want me to do? This should be a lesson for all those in the intelligence community or even in the policymakers. If you're briefing something vague like this, you need to have some recommendations. You need to bracket the problem. If you think the threat, again, going back to 9/11, is that important, you could say something like, Mr. President, I think you need to think about planning a potential war in Afghanistan. Or, Mr. President, I think you need to think about increased security measures at commercial aviation. Or you need to have some sort of recommendation that you can answer if the president turns to you and says, okay, what do you want me to do? It's just something that you need to think about as we go forward. Was 9/11 an intelligence failure? I said this in the lecture, and I'll say this again. There's a lot that could not be intelligence failure, but the Nova documentary brought up the fact that we had 2 known terrorists on watch lists communicating from a known bin Laden safe house in Yemen from San Diego. We knew that. We knew that in the intelligence community, and yet there was no one else besides the National Security Agency was aware. That is for me anyway, that's the conundrum of the intelligence failure. We knew that. We knew that there was communications, yet the FBI was unaware of it. San Diego local law enforcement was unaware of it. None of the other intel entities that were investigating bin Laden connections in the U.S. were aware of it. That is a significant intelligence failure. And I would say a fireable offense for those involved. I would also say that the use of a missile or the use of a commercial aircraft as a Tomahawk missile, for lack of a better term, that should probably have been aware of, if not in the intelligence community, but within the FAA and the commercial aviation security industry. There's no TSA at the time. But that type of attack, there were several plots for this. It shouldn't have been a surprise to anyone who was focused in that area. So I would say those are kind of the 2 intelligence failures. I'll let you draw your conclusions on what you think was the most important part. Okay, Fort Hood shooting, when I did this in class, the question that came up, what point should radicalization be monitored? Hassan, the guy who was responsible for the Fort Hood shooting, he was in the military, and he had said a lot of things to his chain of command that maybe he should have been alerted to. Someone in my in-person class said the fact that he was in the military was a detriment to trying to catch him, because the JTTFs and the people that were aware of his connections to overseas terrorists, they referred that to the Department of Defense and to his chain of command. If this was a Joe civilian running around, the JTTFs would have done their investigation. So just keep that in mind. And if he was a civilian, at what point should radicalization be monitored? I think it's pretty clear from my perspective, the fact that he was not just passively listening to an overseas terrorist official, but he was communicating with that person should have been a warning flag, should have at least opened up an investigation, if not, put him on a watch list. Even then, he still could have committed the Fort Hood shooting because he didn't commit an arrestable offense, but that should have been put on a watch list. And then the question I want you to bring up in your final papers: do we have the appropriate funding, structures, personnel to stop the intelligence failures? Big thing is, why do we still have these happening? Whether it's Fort Hood, whether it's the underwear bomber, whether it's the Boston Marathon attack, despite the billions spent, why do we still have these issues? And that's something I want you to bring up in your papers. And then, is there always going to be low-level attacks? Something to bring up in a paper. Are we always going to have Boston Marathons? If 2 people want to be radicalized and attack such a large target like the Boston Marathon, is there anything we can do about it? Or that's just the way we have to get used to as a society? Questions just to, again, keep in your head, think about when you're doing your final. Okay, so just on to week 7. Just 2 things we're going to talk about at week 7 is leadership targeting and American jihadism, or radicalization here domestically. You have the 2 foreign affairs articles that give a pretty good debate. I'll let you decide about leadership targeting, but it's a pretty good debate on, is it valuable? Are we achieving a proper end state? Are issues of collateral damage and lack of strategic foresight are those inhibiting our leadership targeting program? So read the 2 foreign affairs, the Byman and the Cronin. They're both excellent overviews of the of the drone program. And the question is, is it a strategy or is it just a tactic masked as a strategy? Do we just do it because it's convenient? That it's because we don't want to send ground troops to these places, so we rely on drones, technologies there, and we just do it just to kind of mow the lawn with no real strategic purpose. So that's kind of the first question. When is leadership targeting effective? And then the third question to look at this week, why have we seen this uptick in Islamic radicalism since about 2008, 2009 timeframe? You have the Fort Hood shooting, Times Square bombing, attempted Times Square bombing, Boston. You have jihadists uptick in surfing websites that are jihadist related. You have Americans at an unprecedented scale going to places like Somalia and Syria and Iraq and Yemen and coming back. And why? What are the explanations for this social phenomenon? So those are kind of the questions to look at for the final week. Look forward to the Adobe Connect session on Thursday, and if there's any questions or issues, please let me know.